Dr. Gunnar Heuser studied in Germany and in Canada before he went to the United States. His research on functional brain scans of firefighters was instrumental in passing Bill 15 that limited cell towers on fire halls in 2004. Welcome, Dr. Heuser.
I'm Gunnar Heuser, glad to represent my efforts and the efforts of my wife, Sylvia, who has worked on this presentation, including computer work. And I also would like to acknowledge Libby, who has been instrumental in getting this show underway. My first slide shows the electromagnetic spectrum. This is for those participants who would like to know where a given wave comes from in terms of its frequency and intensity. So it's just an informative slide. And now the next one. I thought I will start with a quote from Albert Szent-Györgyi, who was a scientist who in 1937 got the Nobel Prize for his work on vitamin C. And what he said still applies these days. It says, the basic texture of research consists of dreams into which the threads of reasoning, measurement, and calculation are woven. So that's Albert Szent-Györgyi. And I admire him. As I say, it was in the 1930s that he's got his Nobel Prize. Now I am faced with two questions. And one question is, how did I get involved in electromagnetic fields? And one answer is that years ago, I was on the full-time staff at UCLA. And at UCLA, they have a Brain Research Institute, BRI, it's called. And I was invited to be a member of the Brain Research Institute and given a lab in the Brain Research Institute. So I started in the lab and I did my research. One of the tasks I gave myself was to record electrical activity coming from single nerve cells. In the process of doing that, I got into a lot of problems because there was interference. Now, the Brain Research Institute had a guy attached to it who was an electrical engineer, and his task was to help all the participants who worked in that Brain Research Institute to get good recordings, etc. So I called the man, and he came up and looked at my experimental setting, and he said, oh, what you need is a cage. You need a Faraday cage. And I had never heard of it, but anyway, I said, okay, go ahead. So he constructed a Faraday cage around my experiments. And what this Faraday cage does is to shield the cage from outside influences and interference. And this Faraday cage worked beautifully. And I got good recordings even then and would now even get them now if I used a Faraday cage. So the Faraday cage, the concept has survived. Faraday, lived a few hundred years ago, but his cage is still respected and thought about and practiced. Now, the second answer to my question was, how did I get involved in the field? Is my personal experience that a few years ago I needed a left hip replacement. So I went to the best surgeon I could find, had the hip replacement, and it went real well, and I started walking very soon afterwards. But my incision didn't heal. So I went back to the surgeon and said, you did a fantastic job, but my incision doesn't heal. So he said, oh, must be an infection. Let's try antibiotics. So I took a course of antibiotics and the healing did not occur. So then the surgeon said, why not use another course of antibiotics? I did. And again, the healing did not occur. But then I realized that I was carrying my cell phone in a pocket right overlaying the incision area. So I decided to take out the cell phone and the incision healed. So what we learn from that is that the skin and healing of the skin can be influenced by cell phone frequencies. A more dramatic way of looking at the skin is the following slide. That is a patient I saw years ago, and this little boy went to school, and every time he went to school, he got sick. And then the mother figured out that he got sick because they had turned on the Wi-Fi. And every time that Wi-Fi was turned on in school, he got a swollen face, which we see on the screen right now. And not only that, his leg would swell and his hands would swell. And the hands here are normal hands. And now you see the swollen hands, and the swelling occurred whenever he was exposed to Wi-Fi. So in the literature, you find a description of this called screen dermatitis. And this was described by Olli Johansson, who is a Swedish researcher whom I have gotten to personally know when visiting Sweden a few times. And we now know that screen dermatitis does exist and is triggered by electromagnetic fields, especially in this case, Wi-Fi. Now, going back into my past, way back when I came to the United States and before that to Canada, I worked with a Dr. Hans Selye, and this doctor and I worked together, and we did the experimental studies mentioned here, and were published, and was a peer-reviewed paper which showed that when you inject a rat with dextran, which is a carbohydrate preparation, that rats will have swelling of the forelegs, of the legs, and will also get swelling around their snout. So it's actually a perfect replication or replica of the human experience with swelling of the mouth and with swelling of the hands. So back to Faraday. He was an interesting man who contributed so much to the literature. And what is interesting is that in his 40s, he developed problems with his memory. And I found in his biography a quote from him where he wrote to a friend, "Again and again I tear up my letters, for I write nonsense. I cannot write a line continuously. Whether I shall recover this confusion, I don't know. I will not write anymore, my love to you." And this was a quote from a letter to a loved one by Faraday. And one could well suspect that Faraday, who worked with electricity for many years, was affected by the electricity and the electric currents and electromagnetic fields with which he worked for years. So he may be one of the early samples or examples of a person affected by electromagnetic fields. Faraday was 75 years old when he died in 1867, and it's really amazing that his contribution still has survived all these years, and the Faraday chamber is still acknowledged and actually still practiced. Some patients have constructed a Faraday chamber for themselves and sleep in the chamber and are thus protected from the electromagnetic fields surrounding the area. Now we come to health effects by electromagnetic fields, and the important thing is that there are multiple effects, and what I would like to discuss here is kindling. Kindling is a condition which is well acknowledged in the neurological literature. You can take an animal and give that animal a small, tiny shock, electrical shock. And that shock is so tiny that it doesn't affect the behavior of the animal nor anything else. Now, if you continue these tiny shocks, after about 10 or 20 of those shocks, suddenly that animal will come down with a seizure, even though the last stimulus given was still a tiny one. So these tiny stimuli build up to the point where they can result in a seizure. And I believe that this kindling effect can be used to explain why patients develop sickness, significant disease, and sometimes seizures after repeated exposure to tiny amounts of either chemicals or electromagnetic fields. Now, it's important to realize that a patient who is sensitive to and has been affected by electromagnetic fields can have multiple symptoms. It can affect his personality and her personality too. It can create attention deficit disorder. And so many patients I've seen a few hundred now, with problems with electromagnetic fields. They have multiple clinical problems and complaints. And you have a list here of all the problems that they can develop, which is significant. But the important thing to realize is that these problems are not psychological problems, they are real problems. So now, talking about toxic chemical and EMF exposure, it's important to realize that many of our patients have a history of toxic chemical exposure, and then so many years later, after continuing exposure, intermittent chemical exposure, they will develop sensitivity to electromagnetic fields. And I have quite a number of patients with exactly this story. Chemical exposure first, repeatedly so, and then after a while they come down with electromagnetic sensitivity in a very convincing way. So my diagnosis in these patients is toxic encephalopathy. And I would define it as impairment of cognitive and memory function after neurotoxic exposure to solvents, pesticides, fumes, perfumes, mycotoxins, heavy metals, and electromagnetic fields. So electromagnetic field exposure can work just the same as chemicals do, create problems, and therefore I include that diagnosis with toxic encephalopathy. Now we come to testing of these patients. And I was especially interested over the years to test their brain. And you might want to know that MRIs are very good testing, they constitute very good tests, but they really look at structure and not at function. So in order to see what's going on in these patients, you really need a functional brain scan, such as SPECT, PET, functional MRI. And this is what we're going to discuss now. SPECT is a test which looks at the brain. And the disadvantage, in a sense, of the test is that you need to inject the patient with a radioactive substance which travels to the brain and is metabolized by the brain. And you can therefore create pictures which show how they are metabolized, these molecules given, and that can give you an idea of function of the brain. We published a peer-reviewed paper on this. I had about 60 patients who had problems with chemical exposure, and these problems were long-term, problem with memory, problem with, with other neurological functions, balance, etc. And we had so many patients that I decided to publish this, and the reference is given. And you find here now a typical SPECT brain scan. So if you look, you see that the surface is gray, but then on top of the gray are blue areas, light blue and dark blue. Those are the areas where there is decreased function of the brain in that area. So you look and you find that this particular patient had a lot of problems. And this is a patient who also had cognitive problems and a patient who had memory problems, among others. So this was an abnormal SPECT scan done on patients after chemical exposure. Now, I was fortunate in a sense to see some patients who had been firefighters. And the firefighters had an office, of course, an area where they worked. And the government decided to put a cell tower right at the entrance of their fire station. And these patients, these firemen who had previously been in perfect health, had been tested for good health too, and were found to be okay, now developed headaches, developed problem with cognition, couldn't find their way necessarily when driving. And so they developed illness and especially neurological problems, which is why they came to me. And I worked them up and also did brain scans of the SPECT type. And here is one firefighter having been exposed to the cell phone tower at the entrance to the fire station. And the exposure was in the order of 2G or 3G, as it's called these days. Now you see again, the normal would be a smooth gray area of the skin, of the brain. And you see how disturbed the surface of the brain is. And this is a patient who had developed lots of neurological problems, including severe headaches, disorientation, etc. And I have another patient here. I had a total of about 6 patients, shown 2 here. And again, you see how disturbed the surface of the brain is. And again, this is a SPECT scan of the brain of a firefighter who got sick. And I have accumulated about 6 of these patients. They were all working in the same fire station, had the same exposure to cell phone towers. Now, SPECT scans is one way to look at the brain. PET scan is another one. And the PET scans are also possible. Their problem is that they are often not paid by the insurance company. And yes, you have to inject radioactive glucose derivatives to create pictures of the brain. And we did that, on a number of patients, and found that these patients had problems with the surface of their brain, as the ones we had previously seen, but the brains looked as if they had holes there. I call them function holes. So what you see on this slide is a normal brain surface, left and right, and then below that is the brain of a patient, and this is a patient who was tested with a PET brain scan. Now, the interesting thing is that the results of the PET scan were such that the surface was impaired, as you've seen, but underneath that surface, there's a very active area of the brain, which is shown in yellow, And it shows that these areas of the brain are hyperactive. So we see a combination in the same patient of underactivity, impairment on the surface, and hyperactivity underneath the surface. And this has been described in the literature, but not so much in cases we saw. And so ours may be the first one to describe this discrepancy between the surface of the brain and the subcortical low areas of the brain. The interesting thing was that these PET scans were done on a group of patients who were flight attendants. And they flew Alaska at the time, and then they got sick in mid-flight. And what was figured out is that the cabin was filled with smoke, with exhaust, which was misdirected in a sense, but it did hit the cabin. And then the patients, that is the flight attendants, got sick. And they got so sick that sometimes in mid-flight, they had to decide to bring down the plane to a given airport so that they had their flight interrupted. And they got very sick and then continued to be sick for sometimes years to come. So this is the problem with, here we go. Okay, now there's another functional way of looking at the brain, and it's called functional MRI. And I had a number of patients who had become sensitive to electromagnetic fields, and I decided I would get these functional MRIs on them, and I had about 10 patients, and the results were published in a peer-reviewed paper, and it showed abnormality. And in this particular test, the functional MRI, it looks at connectivity, and some patients are discussed in terms of their connectomes. Anyway, the result of these tests were 10 in 10 patients, all abnormal, all problems with the connectivity, and hyperconnected was what was described by the radiologist who wrote the report. So there's now one aspect left for this study of the brain, which is volumetric study. Very interesting because it shows that the volume of some structures of the brain can be impaired. And the theory behind it is that if a brain cell or brain complex is hyperactivated and works overtime, so to speak, it increases in size. And that will last so long. And then if the stimulus continues and the hyperactivity continues, then the brain loses volume in that area. So what you can see with the volumetric studies is which areas of the brain have increased in size and which areas of the brain have decreased in size. And the report I get looks like this here, which looks at many areas of the brain and gives numbers. And and this shows a blow up of a portion of the brain area. And you see that they look at the volume in the report. And not only that, they compare left and right, for instance, in the hippocampus. So here, for instance, is a patient who had a hippocampus which was smaller than it should be compared with normal population. And not only that, also the right and the left are discrepant in the fact that the left hippocampus is much smaller than the right hippocampus. And we have also decided that there is a difference sometimes in size of the occipital lobes. And this particular patient, you look at the occipital lobes, right and left, and you find quite a discrepancy. The right lobe is much larger and the left is much smaller in size. So it goes from 21% to 6% between right and left occipital lobe. This was a patient who was exposed to electricity by working as a lineman. And linemen are people who climb on poles and correct the situation up on top of the pole where you have transformer and all kinds of electrical activity. And this particular patient, whose pictures we are looking at here, had done this for years and then finally came down with seizures, which is interesting. And we talked about the fact that small amounts of repetitive stimulation can give you seizures in the kindling model. Anyway, this patient then also had a volumetric study done, which you see here. And you see that some of these studies show left and right very much the same. But then there are others, like the occipital lobes and also the hippocampus, where you see a real difference between left and right. And this has to be further explored. These are brand new studies. We may have been the only ones doing these studies, and we will further explore what this means. Looking at the conclusions now. So the conclusions are that you can study the brain in many ways, one of which is to do functional brain scans, SPECT, PET, functional MRI, and also volumetric. These are the studies you can do, and if you do them, you find great and significant abnormalities. Not only that, and we have seen a few thousand patients with chemical exposure and only a few hundred with electromagnetic field exposure. And the important thing is that the patients who come to me with electromagnetic field problems often have a history of chemical exposure. So the two go kind of hand in hand. The brain reacts, it seems, very much the same way. The symptoms are very much the same symptoms between chemical exposure and electromagnetic field exposure. So, and when the two are combined, you get particularly harmful effects. And now looking at our data, where we have the patients we showed who had been exposed to cell phone towers and had gotten sick as a result. You worry about 5G, which has not been explored in terms of its effect on the brain and on other aspects of physiology. The important thing is to realize that we have to worry about cell phone towers, electromagnetic fields, and therefore shielding becomes important. And Peter Sierk, who is a speaker at this conference, is an expert, a world expert on shielding, and will give you a talk which will tell you what shielding is all about and how it can help. We believe in shielding and have worked with Peter and believe that shielding is the answer to many problems which are now present in our society. Thank you. And the last item is, again, a quote. And what that means is that some people will steal your data and eventually claim them to be their data, and also claim that they were the first ones to present certain solutions and aspects. And I've personally experienced that kind of thing. So you have to beware when you are in research. Make sure you publish your data before somebody steals them from you. And this is the end of my talk. We have loved our patients. Most of them love us. And our motto is healing with science and compassion. And the compassion is very important because these people who are sensitive to electromagnetic fields or chemicals are often considered to be crazy. Doctors who support their cause may be called crazy. And so we have found ways of objectively showing that these patients have a real problem. We continue to work in the field and try to help these patients as much as possible. Thank you.